Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, President of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this time, we look at the week's anniversaries in the history of free thought: atheism, agnosticism, secularism, humanism, skepticism, rationalism, what have youism. We discuss notable people, the famous and the not so, who were born or died or achieved something significant in regards free thought during this calendar week. And we look at significant events that took place this week in history: court cases, publishing events, religious riots, burnings at the stake, and other faith-based fun and games. This week, let's start out with a certain crowd pleaser, George Carlin.
Of the all-time champion of false promises and exaggerated claims, religion. No contest. No contest. Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you. He loves you. He loves you, and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all-powerful, all-perfect, all-knowing, and all-wise. Somehow, just can't handle money.
I have as much authority as the Pope, he said. I just don't have as many people who believe it. George Carlin started out as a comic and was a success right from the beginning as a buttoned-up, suit-wearing, necktie-wearing comedian of the old school in the 1970s. This clean-cut, buzz-cut, a young Irish Catholic from New York who subsequently changed his whole image, format, and came out with what he really believed. Beginning a lifelong campaign through humor to shake up American society about its various inconsistencies, prejudices, and nuttiness. He appeared on a host of HBO television specials, and his concerts, especially at college campuses, for 40 years were sold out as soon as they were announced. George Carlin was an atheist, brought up an Irish Catholic kid in Catholic schools in the Bronx in New York in the 40s, and he nevertheless became an avowed atheist. And I could sit here for a half an hour and give you one George Carlin quip after another. But let me just a couple of them. I'm completely in favor of the separation of church and state, he said. My idea is that these two institutions grew us up enough on their own, so both of them together is certain death. And about evolution, he said, when evolution is outlawed, only outlaws will evolve. I think that's funny. And if churches want to play the game of politics, let them pay admission like everyone else, in one of his famous diatribes about how churches get away without paying any taxes. Did he have a religion? Nah. But he had a beautiful mock religion. One of them he said he worshiped Joe Pesci because Pesci always got what he wanted. And in another one, he said, I've begun worshiping the sun for a number of reasons. First of all, unlike some other gods I could mention, I can see the sun. It's there for me every day. And the things it brings me are quite apparent all the time. Heat, light, food, a lovely day. There's no mystery. No one asks for money. I don't have to dress up. And there's no boring pageantry. And interestingly enough, I have found that the prayers I offer to the sun and the prayers I formerly offered to God are all answered at about the same 50% rate. He wrote that in one of his books called Brain Droppings. George Carlin, whose most famous routine was the 7 words you can't say on television. Little personal story, if I may. When I was visiting with my kids in Miami in the 70s, and my sister and I had decided that we would not give each other's kids gifts. She changed her mind at the last minute, so I suddenly had to find a gift for her to give my kids, and gifts to give my kids. So I took my oldest son, David, shopping with me, and I asked him what he wanted. He said, I want the new George Carlin album, The 7 Words You Can't Say. I said, no way. He said, why not? I said, your grandmother, my mother, will go crazy. And he said, but you said I could have whatever I want. So I finally gave in, bought the album. Next morning, Christmas morning, kids enjoying themselves, everybody's having a good time. The adults are having their late brunch with their Bloody Marys. And I realized, where's my son David? Where is him? My sister lived in quite a big house. And I started looking around, where did David go? And then I realized my mother was not around either. So I went looking, and there was a spare bedroom. I opened up the door, and there was my son and my mother listening to the 7 words you can't say on television, and both of them looking at me as if I had just caught them with their hands in the cookie jar. The famous saying, why do grandchildren and grandparents get along so well? Because they have a common enemy and a common interest in George Carlin. My mother was not an atheist, but my sons are. Richard Feynman, the physicist, was born on May 11th in 1918. And one of the most interesting writers and speakers of the 20th century, without question. He was a man who dealt in his popular books like Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and What Do You Care What Other People Think, could discuss physics without talking down to people, but reaching a huge audience who would never think to open a physics textbook once they got out of college or even high school. He described himself as an avowed atheist, even in his early youth. He said, I thought nature itself was so interesting that I didn't want it distorted by miracle stories. And so I gradually came to disbelieve the whole religion. Starting out understanding religion by saying everything is possibly wrong, and as soon as you do that, he said, you start sliding down an edge which it is hard to recover from. He wrote that in a book called The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. A man who celebrated intellectual curiosity and the pleasure of finding things out. He didn't write only popular books, by the way. His academic classic was a 3-volume lectures on physics. But, as his sister Joan once wrote about him, if you wanted to have a good party, you had Richard there. And by the way, as an aside, for all his gadfly image, he made headlines after when the commission, he was appointed to the commission investigating the 1986 Challenger shuttle disaster. And he was the one who figured out and demonstrated what went wrong with the O-rings. Let's go back a little in atheist history, back to the 18th century, as a matter of fact, to 1771, where during that year, on May 14th, Robert Owen, a reformer and a philanthropist, who was born in Wales and who changed the way people think about the conditions of working people in Great Britain, the United States, and eventually all around Western civilization. Owen went to work at the age of 9 as a clerk. By the time he was 18 years old, he was in business for himself. Between those two dates, he taught himself. He gave himself his own education, and became an unbeliever by the age of 14, influenced by the writings of the Roman Seneca and his contemporary chemist John Dalton and the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He set up his own spinning mill, as I said, at the age of 18, married the daughter of a cotton manufacturer, and wound up buying his father-in-law's mills, the New Lanark Mills in Scotland. Became filthy rich and set out at that point to put his humanitarian and free thought ideas into practice. And he turned New Lanark into a model community that attracted the attention of reformers all around the world. The idea being to create a community where the workers worked decent hours, got decent pay, had decent places to live, and where they and their children got education and medical care. What a fantastic idea. At any rate, he set up the first, what was called an infant school in Britain, and a 3-grade school for children under the age of 10, both of which were successful, and he tried to get the British government to follow suit and do the same thing with government funds. But of course, politicians were not particularly interested in spending taxpayer money on the, or as the British say, ratepayer money on the undeserving poor, who were better fitted just to be workers in the mills. And the clergy campaigned against Owen's ideas for the same reasons. They didn't want to stir up the working class, and besides that, they could always use Owen's free thought comments and known atheism against him, which they did, because Owen had publicly said that all religions are false, which doesn't help when you're trying to convince politicians to limit the hours for child labor. But that was an idea that he eventually did get passed. Owen, in the United States, founded New Harmony, a utopian model settlement in Indiana. New Harmony failed after he turned it over to his sons Robert and William, but the idea behind New Harmony struck a chord with the American psyche, and quite a few other utopian communities were founded in the United States. They lasted for varying amounts of times. One of them is just dying out now, the Shaker community, which of course is religious, but Owens was not. These kind of utopian societies die because they depend upon perfection, and they depend upon absolute goodness, and people are neither perfect nor absolutely good, and therefore they don't in the long run work. On the other hand, what they do is set up examples for decent living conditions for the betterment of people, and these ideas did take hold in the United States and Great Britain. Robert Owen. And by the way, much of the trade union movement came out of these settlements like New Harmony. And one biographer called Owen the father of British reformers and one of the highest-minded men Britain ever produced. Owen himself said that finding that no religion is based on facts and cannot therefore be true, I began to reflect what must be the condition of mankind, trained from infancy to believe in errors. And Owen wouldn't put up with errors, so he left religion. Owen is relatively well known to scholars, but not to the general public. But someone who has been almost forgotten, and should certainly not be, is Charles Knowlton, M.D., who was born on May 10th in 1800 in Massachusetts. And Charles Knowlton, M.D., was, like Margaret Sanger, 3/4 of a century later, a pioneer in birth control, before birth control was even a term that you could find in a dictionary. He was a medical doctor and became an ardent foe of Christianity. He wrote The Elements of Modern Materialism in 1829, in which he identified himself as, quote unquote, an infidel. Fruits of Philosophy, or The Private Companion of Young Married People, which he published in 1832, tackled that subject of birth control. Knowlton was trying at the time, or successfully, to teach people about the possibility of birth control, of restricting the number of births that women had to put up with. Remember, this was in a time when delivering a child was a very, very dangerous ordeal for women. And Knowlton, in his book, that Fruits of Philosophy, actually described to people, described to young married couples, is the way he put it, how to prevent conception. And he promoted a syringe-administered douche, and that, of course, in the publication, set the Christian ministers on their ear. They went bananas. Matter of fact, Knowlton published it anonymously, and but it went through 9 U.S. editions, and long after Knowlton's death in 1850, it was taken up by subscription by the Harvard Medical School in 1877. For advocating and practicing and teaching birth control, Knowlton was prosecuted and fined in Massachusetts, sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, got out of jail and went directly to a Free Thought Society meeting in Boston, and delivered lectures on superstition as a moral monster. He was unsuccessfully tried several more times, and when his books were republished in Britain by the atheists Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant, they were tried under the Obscene Publications Act and just narrowly missed going to jail. Of course, what happened was the book had a circulation. It was being purchased at a rate of about 1,000 a year, and after the court case, it went to 250,000, which is an indication of how many people wanted to know about this newfangled birth control. Besant herself, Annie Besant, picked up Knowlton's crusade, if you can call it that, and wrote The Law of Population in 1879, which became a bestseller and helped to hasten the birth of the birth control movement worldwide. Charles Knowlton, MD, born May 10th in 1800, died relatively young in 1850, a delegate to the Convention of Infidels in the United States that met in New York City in 1845, an avowed atheist and a pioneer who helped change the face of Western civilization by campaigning for birth control. We all ought to know him better. Who would have thought that we would be talking about the composer of God Bless America on Atheist History Week? Well, Irving Berlin may not have been an atheist, but he was a freethinker. He was an agnostic, born in Russia, came to the United States, Jewish background. After his first wife died, he married a young socialite Roman Catholic named Ellen McKay in a civil ceremony. Her family disowned her, of course, but they had a long and happy marriage, which produced several children, one of whom, Mary Ellen Bennett, became Berlin's official biographer. She wrote Irving Berlin, a daughter's memoir. That song, which drives me nuts every time I go to a ball game and hear it, I deliberately sit down when everybody else stands up for God Bless America. And as I have told a couple of people on a couple of occasions, it's not the national anthem, and I don't believe in God. Therefore, I do not stand for God Bless America. Interestingly enough, until I started doing this research for this program, I had no idea. Berlin wrote the song as a peace anthem in 1938. And he opposed the whole drive to turn God Bless America into a national anthem, into the national anthem, which was actually thought about seriously in the 40s and 50s. Remember when we were all concerned about international communism, and we had to prove that we were more God-fearing than the godless communists. Berlin himself, as the writer, as the composer of the song, said, absolutely not. He didn't want it to be the national anthem. Even though, as many people have pointed out, patriotism was Berlin's true religion. The man was absolutely crazy in love with the United States of America, but he didn't want that song of his to become the national anthem. He did help promote it when Kate Smith needed a tune, and he wrote it. He helped her out with it, but he was not a churchgoer. His daughter called him not a religious person and an agnostic. He wrote one of his lesser known, as a matter of fact, almost unknown, lyrics were from something called "Pack Up Your Sins and Go to the Devil in Hades." Paradise doesn't compare. All the nice people are there. They come from everywhere just to revel with Mr. Devil, which reminds me of Mark Twain's wonderful epigram, "Heaven for climate, hell for society." Who else? Moving right up to the present, we have Katharine Hepburn. I'm an atheist. That's it. I believe there is nothing we can know except that we should be kind to each other and do what we can for each other. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the 19th century poet. I am a decided skeptic, profess no religious faith, and practice no regular religious observances. Florence Nightingale, the famous Florence Nightingale. The church is now more like the scribes and Pharisees than like Christ, what are now called the essential doctrines of the Christian religion. Christ is not even mentioned. That's just about wraps up this week in atheist history. We've looked at George Carlin, Florence Nightingale, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Charles Knowlton, M.D., which I hope you'll all, whom I hope you'll all remember, even better, Richard Feynman, Irving Berlin, and Robert Owen. I'm John Rafferty, and I hope that you will be back with us next week when we move into the third week in May, and we discuss people like Bertrand Russell, Lorraine Hansberry, Honoré de Balzac, John Stuart Mill, and Alexander Pope. We'll be right here the same time next week, and I hope you'll be here with us to see this week in atheist history. Thank you. Good night.
Wherever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.